Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 160, an introduction to evolutionary biology with Professor Erica Bree Rosenblum of the University of California, Berkeley. And here with me for this introduction is Nick. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
I am very well. How are you doing?
I'm good. No more snow. So
Is it all melted?
It's all melted. Yeah, sure. 1 month ago already.
But still lots of farm work to be doing now, especially? Is this busy season for you?
Yeah, so spring is always a very busy period, sure. So we've got some goats and sheep that we need to take care of, some cows that just got their babies, and yeah, grass is growing like crazy now, so a lot of things to work on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I live basically in the city centre. I'm looking at Manchester city centre right now, so I have zero idea of the additional pressures and responsibilities that living out in the countryside would bring. So on top of an academic career as well.
Yeah, man. Well, I think it was like 2 weeks ago when I was helping some pygmy goats that were giving birth. So quite interesting.
Yeah, wow. And then on top of all of that, you also have to be doing interviews with people as well. But this one I am doing. What's this interview all about?
So this episode follows on from the last one, in which I, as an evolutionary biologist, was actually given an introduction to paleontology by interviewing the paleontologist Professor Roy Plotnick using questions that actually Dave had written for me. Now in this episode, however, the boot is on the other foot, and Dave is actually putting my questions to Professor Bree Rosenblum. Questions such as, what is evolutionary biology? How does evolution work? What even is evolution? How does it differ from paleontology? And to me, importantly as well, what does the field of evolutionary biology actually tell us about past life?
So I don't know if it would come as a surprise to anyone, but throughout my academic and even industrial work as a paleontologist, I'm reliant upon the products of evolution, and I take the existence of that process as a given, but I only really have an undergraduate level understanding of what evolution is and what the mechanisms behind of it are. I recognise its importance, though, and I really feel that I should know more about it. And this is also abundantly clear from our most recent lecture on Patreon, where I got stuck into the genetics of junk DNA with Dr. Chris Playfoot. So please also check out the extra content that we have over there and consider helping support the show.
As Roy Plotnick showed us before in the last episode, paleontology is a huge subject, and there are many ways that the history of life can be studied. If you have enjoyed these last 2 episodes, then there are a lot of other similar interviews we could give of other disciplines, whether that's taxonomy, phylogenetics, statistics, biomechanics, you name it. We always consider your episode requests, so please leave us a comment and let us know what you think.
As you might have noticed, we do not run ads upon our show, never have, never will, but instead we use that time to raise the profile of other shows in our Paleo podcast plug. This show has a familiar voice and might be of particular interest to you if you enjoyed episode 105 on Pharaoh Draco.
Hey, I'm Adele Pentland, the host of Pals and Paleo, where we dive into the form, function, and family groupings of your favorite fossils. We've got some great guests lined up for season 1, plus more pop culture references than you can poke a stick at. You can listen to Pals and Paleo on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or however you're listening to Paleocast.
So please give Pals in Paleo a listen and tell them that Paleocast sent you.
And as always, we've got the images that accompany this episode available on our website, and everything you can do on social media, from likes and shares to comments and ratings, all actually helps us to reach new audiences, and so is greatly appreciated.
Bree has been one of the best interviewees that I've ever had on the show, and she was absolutely full of energy and enthusiasm as we raced through the questions to try and get as much crammed into the hour as possible. I sincerely hope that you find this episode as interesting as I clearly did whilst recording it, and are also left feeling totally jazzed about speciation. Hi, Bree. Thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Great to be with you, Dave.
Right. We always like to get to know our interviewee first and find out how you got into the role that you have now. So when and why did you decide to become an evolutionary biologist?
Well, I'm a professor of evolutionary biology and global change biology at UC Berkeley. And I'm not one of those people that, like, as a 5-year-old was obsessed with evolution. Obviously, I didn't even know that evolution existed or what it was. And I had lots of really broad interests my whole life. But really, for me, what happened was at university, I had an evolutionary biology class. It was my first introduction to the field. And I just fell in love with the topic. And it was not a straight shot from there. I had to beg and plead for that professor to let me work with him for months, if not years, before I had a shot at actually doing evolutionary biology rather than just learning about it. And from there, I did lots of different things. I didn't go straight into a career in science. I was a barista in a coffee shop. I worked in children's museums. I was a yoga teacher. I drove a safari truck. I did all sorts of different things. And then eventually I landed back in graduate school. And I would say that's when there was like a little more continuity to my career path. And I continued along to do what I do now.
Wow. My next question was what was going to be like your alternative career path, but it seems like you've already done them all. Is there anything left that you've not yet done that maybe you could have ended up doing?
I am definitely someone who's constantly like bifurcating in 10 different directions. So I still feel like I might have several alternate career paths in front of me. But this is something that I notice actually a lot with scientists, because even though we think about science as being like something that the intellect is involved in, I think that scientists are often very creative people. And so I think I would have been very happy as an artist or a philosopher or a psychologist or, anything that kind of deals with complex systems. I think that's kind of my underlying interest. So who knows, maybe next year we'll reconnect and I'll be doing something totally different.
So eventually you did end up as a professor of evolutionary biology. What is it that intrigues you about this field, and what has the research in your career focused on thus far?
I am interested in the big questions about how life on this planet came to be what it is, and also more contemporary questions about why we're losing biodiversity so quickly. So my own research focuses kind of on all the different things that shape life on our planet. And there's kind of two sides to that. One is how we get new species. And so I do a lot of work studying the process of speciation. And the other is how we lose species. And so I do a lot of work studying the process of extinction. And obviously you could study speciation and extinction over any time scale, anywhere in the world, with any critters that you want. But my particular interest, for whatever reason, tends to be reptiles and amphibians. I really love the kind of neglected, creepy crawly things on our planet.
That's really interesting, because I can see the role genetics has in evolution, but I've never thought of it as having a role in extinction. I just thought it would have been like, it's gone. That is its role. It's just gone. It's not there anymore. Is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, that's a great
Without
question.
going into massive detail,
Yeah,
I guess.
of course. No, it's a great question. And it's one of the things that I love about evolutionary biology is everything that we think of as an event is actually a process, right? So we know that for speciation, you don't just all of a sudden magically have new species. It's a process. And the same is true with extinction. There's a process that species populations go through that leads to extinction. And that process can obviously have to do with external factors, right? Changes in the environment. And it also can have to do with genetic factors, things that are happening inside of the population, inside of the species.
Whew, right. I knew I was going to find out lots in this interview, but I'm like, we would not even reach the first question, and just like on the off chance, asked the bonus one, and already mind blown. So yeah, I'm not a geneticist. I do not have a background in biology in the same way that Nick does, or that maybe some of our listeners do. So, right, let's start off at the ground and build me up to there. So, could we start by just like defining what evolutionary biology and evolution actually are?
Yeah, and I think what you'll find with me, Dave, and you'll direct me, is that for me, there's always a simple answer and there's always a complex answer. And for me, being a scientist, the fun is having both of those answers simultaneously. So the simple answer for me is that evolution and the field of evolutionary biology is really the study of how life changes over time. And if you go back even to Darwin, who was the first, really to kind of formalize writing about evolution, his definition of evolution was descent with modification, which sounds very esoteric, but basically the idea that there's continuity of life on this planet, right? There's heredity. It's not just that I popped out of nowhere. Like I have a history, as does every single organism on this planet. But that continuity is constantly changing, is constantly being modified, right? We're changing in our own lifetimes. We don't consider that evolution. But any change that happens across generations, we do consider evolution. So that's my simple answer, is that evolution is the study, or evolutionary biology is the study of how life changes over time. Now, there's certainly a more complex answer if you want it, and also certainly contradiction within the field of evolutionary biology. Even different scientists that study different things define evolution differently.
Don't leave us on that cliff edge. Like, you have to explain this. This is getting good.
Okay, I'll give you an example, and I want to preface it with this important caveat, which is that when scientists disagree about things, it doesn't mean that we don't understand what's happening. It doesn't mean that scientists are just confused and don't know anything and are making things up. It means that there's actual debates because we're trying to match our understanding of the world to the actual world as best we can. Right. So I'll give you an example, which is that I do a lot of work in the field of population genetics. That's being a geneticist and mostly studying populations. And a population geneticist would define evolution as the change in genetic composition of populations over generations. So that's a very technical definition. For a population geneticist, that's evolution. It's the change of the genetic composition of populations over generations. But if you talk to a paleontologist or someone that works on really big picture issues, an evolutionary biologist, do they actually care about the genetic changes in a population over a couple generations? That's not their primary concern. So they're going to have a completely different definition of evolution.
Is this question of scale then what differentiates, I guess, the term macroevolution from microevolution?
Yeah. So obviously, since evolution is the process of life changing over space and time on this planet, you could study that at almost any scale, right? You could study it at different spatial scales, locally or globally. You could study it at different temporal scales, going way back in time or just back, 10 years. You could also study it across different scales of the tree of life, right? At local population levels or across, all of mammals or all of fungi or the entire tree of life. So yes, the question of scale is really what differentiates some of the subfields of evolution, and particularly with the terms microevolution and macroevolution, that's usually referring to kind of temporal scale and biological scale. So microevolution tends to focus on smaller things that are happening more quickly, genetic changes in populations, and macroevolution tends to focus on bigger changes across the tree of life over longer timescales. Speciation, extinction, the origin of entire groups of critters, the loss of entire branches.
So we all know some of the famous examples of evolution of new species on ocean islands, for instance. So Darwin's finches. Can you explain what the emergence of a new species, this speciation, is, and how it occurs in these cases of geographic isolation? Let's just isolate these animals and just think of them without any other external factors going on? How do you get a new species from a population?
Yeah, so let me just introduce two very fundamental processes that are contributing to evolution, and then that will help me answer your big picture question. So there's two really big processes that are contributing to how organisms change over time. The first is what we call natural selection, and simply that's kind of how organisms become better suited to their environments over time. And the second is called genetic drift. And that doesn't have anything to do with becoming better suited. That's just the kind of stochastic process of changes that are happening just because changes happen. So in a kind of colloquial way, you can say natural selection is kind of survival of the fittest. There's some problems with that terminology, but we'll go with it. And genetic drift is kind of survival of the luckiest. It's not like, oh, I'm a brown lizard living on brown soil, I'm not going to get eaten by predators. It's just that there's mutations, and those mutations shift in frequency. And so we have changes over time that aren't due to natural selection. Now, if you have geographic isolation, you have a new set of islands that spring up, or you have a river that cuts through a landscape, or you have a mountain range. Anytime you have a geographic isolating factor on the landscape, it's going to separate populations from each other. And it's going to mean that both of those processes, natural selection and genetic drift, work to create differences between populations on one island or the other island, populations on one side of a mountain range and the other side, populations on one side of the river and another side. So that's an opportunity for populations to start what we call diverging. They start changing away from each other. Why do they start changing away from each other? Because they can't exchange migrants anymore. It's unless you're, a bird or a wind dispersed seed, it's harder to get across a geographic barrier. So once you have these geographic barriers, it means that populations are changing away from each other. And after a long enough time, there's this magical, I shouldn't say magical since this is a science podcast, science magic. There's this incredible process that we consider when populations are different enough that we call them new species rather than just variants of the same species. And so that's what's happening on these islands, these famous examples where populations have been separated for a long period of time. They've evolved enough differences that we now consider them to be distinct forms. We could, if you want to, talk a little bit more about how we decide that they're distinct forms and how we decide that something kind of counts as its own species rather than just being a variant of something that existed before. But that's a really kind of interesting and fascinating topic on its own right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we could, any one of these points, I think we could do an entire episode on. We could have an entire podcast on each one of these questions that I'm going to be asking in this. So, species concepts is an incredibly complicated thing that I don't think a lot of lay audiences understand, that how we define a species is different. And
we can move on, but one really interesting part of that isn't theoretical or science jargony at all is just to think about how differently you'd have to define a species for different chunks of the tree of life. Like, how do you decide if two different bacteria belong to the same species? It's a really different question than how do you decide if two different mammals belong to the same species, right? Because some critters don't even have sexual reproduction. And so our definitions of what makes a species are wildly different, not only in different subfields, but across the tree of life. And that's a really, really cool thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So the classic example of species concept would be, you've got a horse, you've got a donkey. They can't reproduce together. Well, they can, but they produce a mule, which is not capable of producing viable offspring, so therefore they're separate species. But then I think a lot of people would look at it and think, okay, well, it's just all in the genetics. But then also we can't use that in paleontology, so we use a morphological species concept. But why does any of this matter? Why does the genetics matter? Because in the real world, we've got this island and that is causing a new species. We've got this river that runs through. We get the new species either side of it. So that's the real world implications. Does it really matter what's going on under the hood when the result is the same?
That's a really good question. And we can go in one of two directions. We can go more social relevance, like why does it matter? Like why should we care? Or we can go scientific relevance of like what's really fascinating about it from a science perspective. So I'll start with the science side, since my guess is we'll kind of expand out into social implications a little later in our conversation. So from the science side, part of what's so cool about looking under the hood and understanding not just how and why this is happening, but in what context it can happen. Because you described geographic isolation, but you can also have speciation in totally different ways. So for example, I study speciation that's happening very quickly without geographic isolation, where there's a major environmental change and that causes the speciation process to kickstart even without an island, even without a mountain, even without a river. And so one of the things we can do by looking under the hood at the genetics is to understand the pace that these things are happening. Like when did some of these mutations arise that are contributing to new species formation? We can also understand whether kind of different species are solving the adaptation and speciation process in similar ways? Like, are there similar genes that are involved in the adaptation process or the speciation process across different species? And so looking at the genetics not only helps us kind of build a temporal understanding, because we can build phylogenetic trees, so we can kind of really articulate like how did speciation happen, when did it happen, how did it happen, but then we can also get at more of like a mechanistic understanding of like what is happening during the speciation process. And that is, to me, just a really fascinating question, because it's not just about like finding a gene and giving a name to a gene, but it's about understanding this incredible process that has shaped every single species on our planet today, including our own species. And so understanding how speciation happens is really fundamental to understanding how life has evolved on this planet.
So what is happening? What genetically happens to create new species? Genes, genomes, explain it. Like, I have never heard any of these things before.
Awesome. So every living thing on our planet has some genetic material. Most things on our planet have DNA-based genomes. You can get into a really fun philosophical argument about whether we should consider things like viruses that have RNA-based genomes, if we should even consider them alive on their own, or whether they only kind of are alive in relationship to the other living things that they exploit. But basically, when we talk about life on Earth, we're mostly talking about living things that have DNA-based genomes. And the really cool thing about genomes is that they're complex. So it's not just that in your genome you have genes that do things, right? Like genes that make proteins that contribute to your immune system, or genes that make proteins that contribute to your eye color. But you also have lots of other things in your genome. You have remnants of old viruses that stuck themselves in there. You have remnants of ancient symbioses, where some genomes were actually incorporated into other genomes. So when we use the term genome, we're talking about the complete set of all of the genetic material in any organism. And what's happening during speciation isn't something that we can just like say, oh, well, A happens and then B happens and then C happens, because there's a lot of different ways that speciation can proceed. But there's always changes in genetics that accompany speciation. Sometimes these are changes in those really important functional regions of the genome, right? So you can imagine if one population and another population have mutations in a really important functional region of the genome that affects something. Well, why don't I give you a concrete example? So I study these cool lizards in the Southwest desert, and there's these lizards that have evolved this totally white color on these white sand dunes, and then lizards surrounding in the Chihuahuan desert that have this darker color. So the mutations that change those lizards' color were selected for so that the lizards could better match the substrate so they don't get eaten, right? But the cool thing is because lizards have a visual mating system, that if you change how much dark pigment you're making, you don't only change the surface of the back surface where the birds would see you, but you also change what we call these sexual signaling colors that are telling possible mates who you are. And so if you've changed your color, you might, as a byproduct of that, change who recognizes you as a mate. And if white lizards and dark lizards stop recognizing each other as mates in this desert environment, then not only are they becoming better adapted to two different habitats, but they're actually becoming different species, if that makes sense. So that's an example of a change in a functional region of the genome that could matter for speciation. But you also could have changes in all sorts of other regions of the genome that just accumulate slowly over time, and that makes these two populations that used to be compatible no longer compatible.
Okay, does it always require some sort of isolation? Because even though we've got these lizards living in pretty much the same area, there's a behavioral, a recognition of the two different groups that creates this isolation between these genetic two different what word am I looking for?
Yep, yes.
I'm almost there. Everyone knows what I mean.
Absolutely.
So we've got behavioral, we've got like geographical isolation. Is that isolation always required?
There's always eventually some kind of isolation. And you're absolutely right that geographic isolation is only one form of isolation. It's probably the most common form of isolation that gives rise to new species. But we also have what in my field we'd call ecological isolation, right? So the two lizards that I study, there's no mountain range between them, but there's an ecological difference in the habitat. So even though technically, a dark lizard could walk over to the light lizard's habitat, the question of the ecological difference, and like you said, the behavioral differences, where there might be differences in mate recognition or mate choice, that those can be as powerful as geographic barriers in isolating populations from each other.
Okay, so if we stick with our lizards as well, we've got a change in their genes, their genotype, and that's affecting their physical manifestation of their beings, and that's the phenotype, that's the physical body that results from that. So is there a way that animals can still look the same, have the same phenotype, but the genotype is different? Or conversely, could we have the same genotype, but a different phenotype?
Awesome. Yes. So the relationship between genotype and phenotype is a really important one in evolutionary biology and obviously in genetics. But there's a third part to that equation. And if we don't include that third part, we miss a huge amount of what's happening in the natural world. And that's the environment. So every single genotype-phenotype relationship is mediated at some level by the environment. It could be internal environment, the biochemistry of your body, but it could also be the external environment, temperature, nutrients, a wide variety of things. So you can imagine it just even as something as simple as human height, right? So our height is determined not only by the height of our parents, although that has a strong contribution. There's a strong genetic or heritable contribution to height, but it's also determined by our environment, how our nutrition was when we were young children, what our society is like in terms of our lifestyle. And so that's a simple example of how genotype, if you just looked at genotype, you couldn't perfectly predict phenotype. And so that missing piece of how the environment contributes is something that we call phenotypic plasticity in evolutionary biology, that you can take one genotype and you can then make multiple phenotypes out of it, depending on the environment. And some of these phenotypic phenotypically plastic traits are super cool. I'll just give you one example. There's this water flea named Daphnia that most people will never have heard of. But if you raise Daphnia, the exact same genotypes, in an environment that has chemical cues that there's fish predators there, they will actually grow these kind of horns and helmets, like more body armor to protect them from predation. Whereas if you grow them in the absence of those cues of predators, they don't waste that energy growing these extra protections. And so that's an example of phenotypic plasticity. Exact same genetics, but totally different traits. Now, your other question of can we get the same phenotype, but in different ways, is also a super cool question. And the answer to that is also yes. So for example, if we just stick with the idea that there's lots of different critters around the world that have evolved different color patterns, and even the ones that have to do, like my lizards, with just whether you're dark or light, that's a simple compound called melanin that we produce that in vertebrates that affects color across lots and lots of different vertebrate animals. And you can kind of make or break melanin by changing lots of different genes in that melanin synthesis pathway. So just because you give me a light colored or a dark colored lizard and you ask me what gene is causing this, I can predict that with some confidence, but not with complete confidence because there could be multiple players.
Wow. And what is epigenetics then?
Oh gosh, epigenetics, man.
Leave it as that. We'll just have that line.
Okay, I'll say one thing and then we can leave it. Is that, it's not just that we have the sequence of DNA that can get mutations in it. It's also that DNA, whether it's being actively expressed or not, is also being changed, right? So you can think of genes as being like little light switches that can be turned on and off, or those gene products can be modified in other ways. The DNA can be packaged in interesting ways. And some of that kind of DNA processing can actually also be inherited. And so that's kind of all in this jurisdiction of this field called epigenetics that looks not only at the DNA itself, but kind of the process of what's influencing how the DNA is expressed and is processed in contributing to phenotypes and also evolution over longer periods of time.
I love this. I do not know enough about any of this stuff, but I find it absolutely fascinating, and I wish that I had done more genetics at school. But anyway, we've been going for like 20 minutes now, just solidly on genetics, and it feels that we've just like scratched upon the surface. And yeah, there is a podcast in each one of these questions. I'll say it again, but let's just leave that there and move on to some of the other big stuff. So, what relevance does this have to the average person on the street today?
Yeah, I think we can't underestimate how important not just the process of evolution is, but understanding evolution. So I'll just touch on each of those two things individually. First of all, the process of evolution, even if the average person on the street doesn't know what's happening or doesn't understand much about it, the process itself has and is shaping their entire lives. So we don't exist without 4 billion years of history that happened before us on this planet. We don't exist without our evolutionary relationships to everything that came before us. And it's not only about understanding our deep history, it's also understanding our contemporary experience on this planet and also contemporary threats to our experience on this planet. So if you don't understand anything about viral evolution, and you don't understand anything about the evolution of the human immune system, you cannot create a vaccine for COVID. You cannot create a vaccine for the flu. And you cannot predict how the flu vaccine should change from last year to this year or this year to next year. All of that is predicated on an understanding of evolution. And so evolution touches every aspect of our lives, and understanding evolution has incredible implications, not just in our daily lives, but particularly in biomedicine, where the entire, really the entire field of biomedicine, like we have to understand how we evolve and how pathogens evolve to understand the relationship between those two. So one of my favorite questions on the final exam for one of my classes, and hopefully none of my students are listening to this and have a leg up, but
they probably won't be.
Is I always like to ask a question about if my students had to guess about my feelings about antibacterial hand soap, what could they say? And so they have to kind of dig deep into like, well, what do we know about evolution? What do we know about how humans actually influence the evolution of other creatures on our planet now? Like they have to think a lot about different things, because even something as simple as antibacterial hand soap is actually creating a selective environment for bacteria. And so we are now not only the products of billions of years of evolution, but we are right now changing the environment of evolution for all the other species on our planet. And it's not only with antibacterial hand soap. The other changes that we're making to the global environment are also changing the conditions that other species are going to need to evolve and adapt to, or fail to evolve and adapt to. And that's part of what's causing the huge biodiversity crisis we're seeing, because a lot of species can't adapt to the human changes in the environment.
How important is it that people understand that? And what role does the media and does like news and TV and film all ruin that? I don't know why, but in my head, I've just got Albert Einstein. He's in front of his computer, boop, 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 and now there's a picture of a double helix floating around, and yeah, he's comparing two strands of DNA overlying one over each other. Typical sci-fi film stuff. That seems to be like all that we see.
Yeah, or real kind of catastrophism, right? Like I think the media is good at those two extremes, kind of the sci-fi extreme or the like everything's, going to pot extreme. And I think that what we're missing is the intermediate connection and responsibility extreme, or not extreme, middle ground, right? Because if you think about how we treat people, animals, and things in our own homes, in our own home, we're aware that we're creating the environment that other things have to survive, right? I'm aware with my children that I'm creating the environment that will help them thrive or not. Even with houseplants, like I'm aware that it's my responsibility to water them, right? And I think we forget that it has become true now that the earth is our home, not only in that we're one species here, but our impact on this planet has become so pervasive. It's the first time in the history of this planet where a single species is creating the environment that other species have to live in. And that, if we made that mindset shift to think about this extended environment is really now our home, not just because we live here, but because we have to take responsibility for it. And we have to think about what environment are we creating for the other species? Not just what environment am I creating for my children in my physical house, but what environment am I creating for other species in the surrounding areas around my house globally? And to me, that feels like we don't, the media certainly doesn't like to talk about that kind of, it's harder to talk about connection and responsibility in those ways. But it feels to me that it's essential not just for the survival and thriving of other species, but in the end, it's essential for our species, because we don't have a future on this planet if we destroy the ecological networks on it. If you think about kind of the value of biodiversity, not just inherent value, but the value to us, to sustaining our species, it's immeasurable.
Yeah. I'm all depressed now.
Well, I think that the upside of that, instead of having that feel like a downer, is that connection is actually not hard to foster. If you think about every level of biology is telling a story of connection, right? Our even the DNA helice you were talking about, like the first time that anyone sees that on the screen, instead of it seeming like an abstract thing, it's actually a very personal thing. It's something that exists in your body, and that DNA, the helix of DNA, is bound by bonds. Every single little base pair on that DNA is bound by physical chemical bonds, and then the same is true at the cellular level. The cells in our bodies, they don't work without each other. Like we are an ecosystem that is founded on cooperation. And the same is true if you look outside of our bodies, right? Like every ecological network on the planet requires all of the members in it to thrive. And so I think that there's an upside that's not just like we're destroying the planet kind of feeling, but an upside that's like, it's just that we haven't been focusing on the right things, and we haven't made it our business to kind of focus on the culture of connection. And how do you foster that? How do you help people understand it intellectually? But how do you also help people value it and foster it in their lives? And so to me, I actually feel really excited about this century. I don't feel like this is just, the end of a story where humans were the villains. I think that this is a time where we really get to decide as individuals, as communities, and as a species, like what it is we value, what it is we care about, and how do we, shift our activities a little bit so that we better, are living from those values.
Yeah, it's a nice way of thinking about it. So when we are looking at education and the public and what people know about evolution, how it works, what it does, why it's important, are there any common misconceptions that you see?
I think that the most common misconception in not only in the general public, but also in students of biology, even at the university level, is there's a lot of misconceptions about human evolution. And I think if we misunderstand ourselves, then we start to misunderstand a lot of things. So one example of this is just like the common cartoon you see of, human evolution, where you see like, there's monkey, and then there's something that looks a little less like a monkey, and then there's something that looks kind of like a caveman, and then there's you know what I mean, that like cartoon progression. And I often give that to my students, and I say, critique this, tell me all of the misconceptions that this cartoon represents. And there's a lot of them. There's this misconception that, we evolved from apes rather than we and modern day apes evolved together from a common ancestor. There's also this sense of like linearity of like, we're kind of like the top notch. And it gives the impression that human evolution has ended, or that we're kind of the be all end all. It also gives a very linear perspective, like we're the only humans that have ever lived. And that's also not true. There's been dozens of human species on the planet. Some of them have even coexisted in space and time. And so we are only the most recent of, kind of a whole subtree of humans. And so I think that that's just as an example of like one common suite of misconceptions where we don't understand our own kind of biological history. We don't give credence to the kind of the deeper family tree beyond our own personal ancestry. And I think that leads us to a kind of slightly twisted understanding of our place on this planet.
So now that we're all hooked on evolutionary biology and genetics, what would one need to become a student of that? Do you need, like a biology at university? Do you need to go in straight at evolutionary biology? Are there evolutionary biology courses that you can do?
Yeah, to me, I think evolutionary biology is such a diverse, integrative, and kind of multidisciplinary field that you don't need, obviously some background in biology is going to be important, but you don't need some kind of very specific technical prerequisites to begin a study or an exploration of it. For me, if someone wants to eventually become like a practicing professional evolutionary biologist, there are kind of three questions that they're going to have to eventually answer. And so those are nice for people to think about, right? One is, what are the kinds of questions you're drawn to? And I can talk more about that, but like there's questions from what's happening at the cellular level to questions of what's happening at the macroscopic level. And so kind of knowing like what kinds of things, what kind of questions you're interested in is important. So for me, once I figured out like, oh, I'm really jazzed about speciation, like that's a sub area of evolution that gets me excited. It helped me channel my interest into something specific. So that's the first, is people need to know kind of what topics or questions excite them. The second is to start thinking about what kind of methods you like using. So you can be an evolutionary biologist and spend all of your time wandering around in the desert or the rainforest or the ocean and being a field biologist. But you could also spend all of your time in front of a computer and be a mathematical modeler of evolutionary processes. So kind of understanding what methods appeal to you is important. And for me, once I realized that like I love field biology, I love being out in nature, wandering around, getting to know the ecosystems, but I also need something really concrete to do with that information. And if I can bring what I learned back to the lab and do some genetics work, for me, that was like a really good marriage of methods. And the last is that you need a study system. If you're going to do original work, obviously you can just be in love with everything and read about it and learn about it. But if you're going to do original research, it needs to be focused on something. And so whether that's, I've worked on fruit flies, I've worked on hippos, I've worked on lizards, I've worked on all different things. And for me, once I realized like, I don't know why, but I love those lizards, like a lot came into focus because then I had a topic, speciation. I had the methods I liked, field research and lab research, and I had a slice of the tree of life, lizards. And when I put those three together, it's kind of a unique combination of where my research has drawn me. I also want to make it very clear that that's not a one and done thing. It's not like you figure out, and this is true for any career in the world, it's not like you figure out what you're interested in and then it stays the same for your whole life. And one example of that for me is that I had been studying speciation in lizards, but my colleagues that were studying frogs had started noticing all of these frog die-offs around the world. And as we started talking more and more about it, I started getting really fascinated in whether there was something I could contribute to better understanding why amphibians were disappearing around the world. And so I kind of jumped from studies of speciation to studies of extinction, not because I made a conscious decision that would be like really elegant for my website, but because something happened in my professional life that shifted my interests. And so for folks that are out there who might be interested in evolutionary biology or really any science, I think it's important to remember that you're not only going to choose something to work on, but that things are going to choose you, and that your life and your profession is going to continue to evolve and change. And so you have to be open to those changes.
You said then one of the greatest phrases I've ever heard, really jazzed about evolution. I want that on a t-shirt. I think it was jazzed about genetics, jazzed about evolution.
Well, I think that there's this misconception of scientists sometimes that like we're really rational, linear thinkers and like it's all about the knowledge. And I think that it leaves out that jazzed part, right? Of like what's exciting, what's interesting, like what are you curious about? And I think that scientists get portrayed, inaccurately in our media as being these kind of like cold, rational people out there with measuring tapes, rather than people that are like wearing flashy, jazzed about evolution shirts.
So true. Right. So if we take all of our evolutionary biology students and check the pipeline between their undergrad degrees and the position in a university being a research scientist, it is a very leaky pipeline.
Yes.
How many leaks does this pipeline have? Is it exceptionally leaky, and does it have any selection on who is leaked out of it?
Yes, it is a very leaky pipeline. It's also a very different pipeline in different parts of the world. So, for example, the process of going from an undergraduate degree to a professorship in the US is radically different from that same process in Europe. And so there are some commonalities in like where the leaks are and what we can do to solve them. But I think that the important thing is well, I'll give you a personal anecdote, and then we can talk more systemically about it. When I was a graduate student, I think it was my first or second year, so it was at the very beginning of that process. I was in a big lecture hall, and someone was giving a lecture on the leaky pipeline, and was giving actual statistics about how many of us in different identity groups would end up being successful. It was one of the most depressing hours of my life, especially because if you are in any identity groups that are less likely statistically to be successful, whether that's being female, whether it's being from a minority background, whether, any number of aspects of our own personal histories that influence how we're seen in the world and what opportunities we're given. This particular lecture was comparing statistics just between women and men, and basically saying, like, for the women sitting in the audience, like, it is vanishingly less likely not only that you finish graduate school and become a junior professor, but that you actually continue on your field and really become a leader. And I remember sitting there and thinking that at some point, every single one of us has to make the choice of whether we see ourselves as a statistic or not. Because if I see myself as a statistic, then this is a pretty depressing proposition. And if any of us see ourselves as statistics, it can really feel demoralizing. And I remember at that moment thinking, I need to actively not see myself as a statistic. I need to actively figure out what are all of the factors that would kind of prevent me from excelling in the directions that I want to move. And I need to address those. Now, that's a very personal approach of kind of self-responsibility. That cannot happen in isolation because we need systemic changes so that people who are sitting in those same lecture halls and don't have that little brain switch that I had, which is like, okay, this is all depressing. I'm gonna take the bull by the horns and like make it work. There's, for every one person that has that random brain chemistry, there's going to be 10 people in that audience that hear that same lecture and think, oh, wow, it's not even worth continuing. Right. And so we need a system that gives kind of a pathway for success, not only for all different kinds of people from all different kinds of backgrounds, but also all different kinds of thinking, all different kinds of approaches. And there's a lot of work being done right now in science to address that leaky pipeline issue. And I would say that, that for me, that moment in that lecture hall was almost 25 years ago. And the culture of science has changed dramatically in that 25 years. It's a much better time to be entering science as a young professional now than it was then. And it's a much better time for folks kind of all different backgrounds and interests and persuasions to be entering science. It's a culture that's much more concerned now about welcoming and belonging and diversity than it was then. It does not mean that we're all the way there by any stretch of the imagination. And I run workshops for young scientists all over the world. And one of the things that I find over and over and over again is that when I ask people how they feel about their own research and how excited they are about their career prospects, even the folks that are super excited and feel great about their research and great about their kind of local environment where they're being trained, when I start asking bigger picture questions about how optimistic do you feel about your future, how good do you feel about the broader culture of science, there's always a lot more hesitation there. And so you can have people, if I say, give me, fingers up on a scale of 1 to 10, like how good do you feel about your research? Someone who puts up like 9 or 10 fingers. And then I ask the next moment, how good do you feel about the overall culture of science? All of a sudden fingers start dropping down and I've got, 5s in the audience. And so I think that it shows a kind of general feeling that some of the big picture things still need to change, and that we need lots of different kinds of voices and approaches in order to make those changes.
So if we did leak out of the evolutionary biology pipeline, are there many opportunities outside academia? Or is there plenty of employment out there?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a funny thing when you ask an academic what else people should do besides academics, because we all are influenced by our own personal experience, and I did go in the direction of academia, and I see pros to that as well as some cons to that. But outside of academia, there's lots of opportunities, especially because evolutionary biologists are not just evolutionary biologists; they're biologists. And they're not just biologists, they're scientists. And so once you start looking at like, okay, what are the transferable, translatable skills that an evolutionary biologist has? It's huge because people can be engaged in all sorts of careers that require biological thinking or scientific thinking. And so I think we make a mistake when we're training young scientists that we narrow them down into kind of what it takes to be a success in this particular area without reminding people that along the way, they've accumulated this vast skill set that's applicable to all different sorts of things. So a lot of my students do stay in academia, but a lot of them become scientists outside of academia. Some of them work for the government or for conservation agencies. Many of them go into education, not necessarily in an academic context. Some of them become kind of consultants or project managers in other industries. Some of them go into biotechnology or kind of more biomedicine. There's a huge range of fields that need evolutionary thinking, particularly because evolutionary thinking itself is about thinking in complex systems and thinking in networks. And I'll just, end this piece with a quote that is a famous quote within evolutionary biology. It's from the 70s from a well-known evolutionary geneticist named Dobzhansky. And he said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And the argument for him was about the discipline of like, we really need evolutionary thinking in order to understand biology. But I would say that the same is true on a career path, is that if you have evolutionary thinking, you can apply that to so many different arenas, not just of science, but also of society.
Okay. Wrapping things up now already is absolutely flown by, and I'm aware of the time and keeping you too long. Have humans stopped evolving?
No, that's the shortest answer you're going to get from me the whole day.
Okay, awesome. Looking at evolutionary biology as a whole, are there any biases? Is it entirely focused too much on humans and flus and stuff and missing a lot of the important stuff to do with, I don't know, nudibranches and other weird marine invertebrates that no one's ever heard of?
I think that's less true now than it was in the past. I think the value of diverse researchers researching diverse things is very well known. Certainly, there's a focus on human evolution and human medicine. That's obviously important for our own interests in ourselves. But I think there's a wide variety of people studying, wacky things, and I love that. It's something that it's part of. What gives me hope is I think about, of the millions and billions of humans on the planet, if each person was just interested in one weird thing, that's a lot of things that get our attention, right? And that's true in scientists too. Like you take the hundreds of thousands of scientists and why am I interested in lizards where someone else is interested in lions? Why is someone interested in microbes and someone else is interested in mammals? We don't have to explain that. We just have to embrace it and make sure that we have support and funding, for all of these different basic and applied aspects of science. I think it's wonderful. And I think that is, in different contexts, it's more or less celebrated, but it's certainly an important aspect of how we bring the science in line with the world, because the world we live in, it's a very diverse place, and we need to study it in diverse ways in order to, like you said, love the nudibranchs as much as the elephants.
How has the field of evolutionary biology changed over the course of your career, and where do you think it will go next?
That's a hard question. It's funny because I'm not a predictor in my field either. Like my science is like I study the past and the present, and there are scientists that study the future. So I think there's actually ways that we are kind of hooked up mentally that direct our interests. So when you ask me a future question, I'm like, I don't care. Not that I don't care about our future, but it's like, I'm really fascinated by what's happening now because that's what's going to determine the future. But I will do my best to answer your question briefly. I think that, one of the things that's happened over the last, 25 years while I've been, really a practicing evolutionary biologist is further integration across really diverse fields. So it's not just that, genetics is incorporated in novel ways, but that the study of development is incorporated in novel ways. The ways we use mathematical theory is incorporated in novel ways. The technology has changed so dramatically that we can ask questions that there's no way we could have, even 10 years ago. We can, put a teeny little radio backpack on a bee and track where it flies. We can sequence, an entire human genome in 10 minutes for a couple $100. It's just the technology has changed the landscape so dramatically that I've seen a lot of not only technological innovations, but then that changes what questions we can ask. And so innovations on the question landscape. And where I think things are going, that's harder for me to answer because I feel like we're at a real crux moment in not just evolution, but also in academic science and also in our society where kind of deciding what our priorities are is going to change the future in really dramatic ways. So I feel like that's the interesting part is like, how do you get people to really be thoughtful about what their values are, what their priorities are, and then how they're going to shape their field based on those values and priorities? I think that's going to be what determines our future.
Wow. And just because I didn't ask it before, what is the distinction for you between evolutionary biology and paleontology? Should there be a distinction? How do you define the two?
Yeah. So for me, if we think about evolution in its broadest sense of studying, the processes and products of life on this planet, that for me, paleontology is, and you as a paleontologist might take issue, so I'd be really interested in hearing that. But to me, paleontology, it's a part of that big umbrella of studying evolution. Is that paleontologists are focusing their time and energy and intellectual interest on kind of a particular time slice in the Earth's history, which is that kind of those more ancient periods that were prior to our modern epoch, right? And so that determines what some of the methods are, what some of the questions are, what some of the answers are. But to me, I consider paleontologists to be studying evolution. And in fact, some of the most foundational aspects of our understanding of evolution come from paleontology. So I wouldn't draw those as like two separate circles that need a bridge to connect them. I would draw those as very interdependent circles that have had a long history of interaction and mutual reinforcing.
Could it be that paleontology is the study of evolution using only phenotypes?
I guess for me, that feels a little limited because now there's I think maybe some decades ago that would have made more sense, but I have plenty of colleagues that are paleontologists that now use, genetic tools. We can get ancient DNA out of fossils. We can do all sorts of incredibly sophisticated things that push beyond the boundaries of saying, oh, paleontology. Because if you look on like a Webster dictionary, like the old fashioned definition of paleontology is basically like people studying fossils, right? And I think modern paleontology has evolved quite beyond that simplistic definition. I think paleontologists are deeply interested in kind of new technologies that give new windows into the past. And I also think paleontologists are really interested in the processes that have that have led to the observations they're making, not just kind of the outcomes of phenotypes, in particular strata.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. I wasn't saying that as my thoughts on it.
You're trying to catch me.
Okay, and then just to end on, which concept of evolution would you like the world to understand?
For me, I think we've already touched on this quite a bit today, but I think that interconnection as a scientific reality of our planet, of our ecosystems, of our bodies, of our history, like that to me is the most important foundational teaching of evolution, not in a cheesy, like we're all connected way, but in an actual grounded, deep, fundamental, factual, like we are all connected. And if we could better understand that truth as not just a scientific reality, but as basically an instruction for how we're supposed to be living our lives and how we're supposed to be interacting with other species on this planet, I think that would make a phenomenal difference, not just for evolutionary biologists, but for our society at large.
Okay, well, Bree, I've taken up more than enough of your time. I wish I could take up many, many more hours, but thank you very much for coming on and giving us all an introduction to that.
It was a pleasure, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall with Liz Martin Silverstone, Tom Fletcher, Nick Lupsher, Emily Keeble, and Sophie Pollard. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, our listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll gain access to additional multimedia content, and thanks to everyone who's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs. And follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.